Hallie Lieberman, thank you so much for joining me on the Orgasmic Lifestyle Podcast. It's a real pleasure to have you here. I was sent you a book, Buzz, A Stimulating History of the Sex Toy in 2017, because I wrote an article for The Guardian about my career as a sex toy tester. And then it was on my shelf for 3 years. I didn't actually read it until lockdown, and I couldn't believe how incredible it was. It's a real treasure, and especially for me working in this industry, I can't believe there's so many things that I didn't know of. It's really amazing. So I wanted to ask you, what drew you to the history of sex toys? Were you into history first or sex toys? How did it happen?
So it was definitely sex toys first. And as I talk about in my book, I was like 11 years old when I was first introduced to sex toys when I was on vacation with my parents in the Florida Keys. And we were at this hotel that had a resident dolphin, which was amazing. But anyway, so I was rifling through the drawers in the hotel, as I usually do, looking for anything like, a Bible or anything like that. I opened one up, found this phallic thing in a zippered container, opened it up, took it out and said, "Mom, I found a pencil sharpener." And she said, "Hallie, she has a really high-pitched voice, but anyway, yeah." And she didn't, I was like, "Well, what is it if it's not a pencil sharpener?" And she did not tell me what it was. And somehow later I found out what it was, but I knew that thing had power. My mom was so upset about me touching it. So that kind of was my first intro into it. And then it went from there.
Fantastic. And the book is so well researched. There's over 50 pages of the bibliography and end notes. How long did it take you to write?
Well, it was my dissertation. So it probably took me 5 years or something, researching, or 6 years researching and writing all across the country and in England as well. I went to as many archives as I could.
That's amazing. I can't believe there's so much information in it. And I thought I knew a lot about sex toys. I've been a reviewer since 2013. I have 700 sex toys in my possession, and now I'm a designer. I've also seen the film Hysteria. You think you know a lot after all of that. When I was reading your book, there were so many things that I realized I didn't know, and some things that really surprised me. For example, the things that really surprised me, one of them was that, I don't know if I remember correctly, strap-ons were initially for married couples. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And that surprised me as well, because when we think of strap-ons today, what do you think about when you
lesbian sex, I suppose, or pegging?
Exactly. Those are the two things that come to mind: lesbian sex or pegging. And those are sort of not as mainstream as heterosexual intercourse, although they should be. But yeah, strap-ons were initially for impotent men. This was pre-Viagra. And so we're talking about the 1950s, 1960s. If a man couldn't get a hard-on, what would they do? Well, one of the things they would do is use a hollow. That was the difference between a lot of strap-ons today, hollow strap-on penis. And that was a boon for sex toy companies, because in the US, at least, it was illegal to sell sex toys. So but you get around that if you were selling them for heterosexual sex with married couples. And that's why we call them marital aids. And so they came with, and the people who made them, one of the women who helped work on them, riveted planes during World War II. So that's why they had the rivets, with the straps. But a lot of people would buy them and of course use them to masturbate. But our government was afraid of women masturbating. So if you sold them for heterosexual sex, then they were less threatening, because that's where women were supposed to get sexual pleasure. And if women, took the straps off, well, they didn't know about that. They were selling them for the right purposes.
Yeah, that's incredible. That really just surprised me. Another thing that really surprised me was that the feminist movement wasn't very concerned about sex toys or orgasm. That's something that stuck out a lot for me.
Yeah, well, there was a branch that was the mainstream, but you're right, the mainstream feminist movement, like Betty Friedan, who said 1,000 vibrators wouldn't change the course of feminism and stuff. There were people who fought against it. So the mainstream movement was like, let's, boardroom, not bedroom. Let's get political rights. And you see this over and over again with movements where it's like, okay, we need to get other kinds of rights and sexual rights and reproductive, anything with sexual pleasure, those rights are put on the back burner. But yeah, I mean, you had Betty Dodson, who was at these consciousness raising groups saying, what about orgasm? Women are having orgasms. This needs to be corrected, and people are like, shut up. Like, why are you, people are going to make fun of us. So the pioneers of sex toys were really fighting against not only the general society, but against people within the subculture they were in as well.
Because I guess sex wasn't really seen as something for women, even by the women themselves. That's quite curious. It was seen as something for male pleasure.
Exactly. It was a sexual revolution, but women were like, look, men are coercing us into sleeping with them. Like, we need to say no. It was like using sex, like denying sex as a form of power, as opposed to saying, no, we're getting off on it too. Like, we just need men to go down on us, not just fuck us. Like, that would solve the problem. But like, that wasn't the thinking among mainstream.
Interesting, incredible. Another thing I saw that was interesting was that a lesbian shop you talked about, there were no phallic toys. So toys couldn't be phallic, which is interesting.
Yeah, there were two shops. So the first feminist sex toy store in the US, Eve's Garden, had no dildos. She was like, anti-dildo, no way, because a dildo was a symbol of the patriarchy, a physical symbol. It was a dick. So if you were saying you hated the patriarchy and then secretly going home and fucking yourself with a dildo, what would, they saw personal as political, like they were connected, then you were a hypocrite. So it took for her at Eve's Garden, for Della Williams, who was worked for National Organization of Women, for her to allow dildos in there. She actually designed them and worked with a designer to design feminist style dildos with Gosnell Duncan, who's a paraplegic who was invented the silicone dildo. And so the feminist dildo was pink and purple and non-phallic, didn't have, or non like 100% looking like a dick with veins. Yeah.
That's so interesting. Another thing that's interesting as well is, at the beginning of the book, you're in the present day, and you talk about some safety issues. So it's really interesting that safety, that's one of our biggest concerns. It hasn't evolved that much, really, considering how many years have gone by. That's quite concerning.
Yeah, and you probably know more about this than I do. Like, what is the safety of toys now? Like, I don't even, like, would you say most sex toys are safe, or?
Well, the thing is, there's no testing of the materials, and some people say, it's body safe silicone, but it has this weird smell. So if it has that kind of new car smell, it's supposed to have lots of chemicals in it. And if things are flexible, they tend to be more toxic, so what I've heard. But I have a rabbit vibrator that's transparent, made of jelly, which was from maybe 15 years ago, those typical rabbit vibrators that had the pearls inside. And it started to disintegrate. It's quite shocking. It's literally fallen off the files. I just keep it just for reference, just to show people not to buy jelly toys, because there's still some shops selling jelly toys around. So it's really quite scary, and people don't realize I think people should invest a bit more in sex toys, not just go for the cheapest thing, because you're putting it on your genitals. And also for butt plugs, I think the flared base is not wide enough. There are stories that are in the press. There's a couple of stories. I read one from this girl who was playing with a butt plug with her boyfriend, and then suddenly they said, "Where's the butt plug?" And then they were looking for it everywhere. And then she lay on her belly, and her belly was vibrating or something, and she had to go to A&E. There's a really weird picture of a X-ray with this butt plug inside. But it's really good that she actually shared the story, because these flared bases, which are not very big at all, are just too narrow. So I think people need to think about making those butt plugs wider. Definitely.
I had not, this is a part of sex toy safety. Like, I knew it had to have a flared base, but I, until now, didn't realize that some of the bases weren't flared enough, and that I hadn't heard of the story. That is terrifying.
Yeah, the typical ones with those jewels, I mean, that's not wide enough. You know, the ones that are supposed to have some kind of jewel at the bottom, it's like, no, that's just, might look nice, but it's not going to look so good if you go to A&E, you know.
Oh my God. And what is A&E? Like
The accident and emergency ER, sorry.
Okay, no, I was just clarifying. Is that what they say in, like, you're in Spain right now, right?
Yeah, but I'm actually British, so yeah, so it's a good that you corrected me, because maybe most people who listen to this will probably based in the US, so that's good.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely.
And you don't in Britain, they don't regulate sex toys, right? Like they don't,
like, they do anywhere. I mean, I think, for example, condoms are regulated, but I mean, to actually regulate sex toys will make the procedure or the kind of development more expensive and more lengthy. And I remember being at the Aerofame sex toy fair in Hanover. I go every year, and there was a company that was doing safety just to check, you know, nickel. You know, for example, the charging points should not be near the body. That's another thing.
Yeah.
So and then no one was going to this stand. It was incredible. There's this like company that was, you know, testing sex toys on behalf of companies. No one was interested. Everyone's just like, get them out there, sell them. So I guess with all the shame associated, it's very difficult to attribute some kind of issue to a specific toy and the company. It's very difficult to actually have any legal problems, I suppose. I guess lots of things happening that we don't find out about.
Yeah. And I mean, I wrote about this a bit in my book, in the history. I mean, there have been dangerous sex toys. There was one that like perforated someone's cervix, like some sort of vibrator. I mean, we even going back to, and this was a user error, but going back to like 1919, when there was, when electricity was new. Actually, maybe even before this, but a woman used a plug-in vibrator in the bathtub.
Oh, wow.
And she died because she electrocuted herself. And they didn't really have warnings. I mean, people just didn't understand you can't use vibrators in the bathtub back then. But later in the 50s, and that was back when vibrators weren't openly marketed as sexual. But later in time, in the 50s and 60s, there were dangerous vibrators that hurt people. Or I wrote about like dildos made of the same equipment tires were made of that you shouldn't be putting in your vagina, and that smelled awful. And if they didn't work, if consumers had a rash from them or some problem, they were too embarrassed, especially because they were like illegal. And in the US, sex toys have been illegal in certain areas. There still are technically in Alabama, even where I live in Atlanta. Until 2018, there was a suburb sex toys were illegal. And so when you have this device that has, you have the shame, you have the cultural shame of it, and then you have it's either illegal or marginally legal, you can get away with selling anything because people aren't gonna, march on Washington to say that butt plug, went up their ass and into their stomach. I mean, very few people are going to be open about that.
Absolutely. For me, personally, I always use condoms for insertable toys all the time, because I've had a couple of trips to ER myself.
Really? Wait, what happened?
It's quite awful, really. I've never really shared this before, but it was from some Kegel balls. The Kegel balls that are very textured. I'm really against that. And also some Kegel balls that have holes between the string. Have you seen that? I mean, that's so dangerous because you can never clean them properly. But basically, it's happened to me a couple of times actually, where I've had this thing called Bartholinitis. I don't know if you've heard of that. It's the Bartholin glands, which are the glands that that lubricate the vagina. So I got kind of it got blocked. So one of my labiates got really big and swollen like a cyst, and it was the most painful thing I've ever been through. So, and I remember actually the first time it happened to me was the first time I went to the sex toy fair in Hanover, and I was just looking around thinking, I wish there was some safety in this place, And then 2 days after, when I got back, I remember I went with a company and everyone was like laughing and dancing and getting wasted, and I was on that, I was just like walking around in kind of pain. a bit like John Wayne. Then when I got back to Spain 2 days later, I couldn't walk because it was so bad. I had to get a taxi and go to the doctor and get penicillin, and then they had to kind of like pierce it to get all the pus out. It was a really very and then you've got this cut. It's a very painful experience. And when you go to the loo to urinate, you've got that acid on this cut. It's like, oh my God, I have to do it in the shower. It was just the most painful thing ever. So now I even use condoms with Kegel balls. And also I do kind of work on the development design side of toys as well. So I'm always making sure that things are as safe as possible. Let's say smooth surfaces, no textures, no kind of place where germs can harvest, because it's really scary, and there's no control over this, and you find out the hard way, because obviously with 700 toys, it's imagine something's going to happen on the way after all that testing, so.
Oh my God, that is so scary. And I've never, I talked to a lot of sex toy companies and users. I'd never heard of that happening. That's something. Do you know what caused it, or in particular?
It just could have been some bacterial being inside too long. So I think there's just something that causes a blockage. So it's a very ambiguous, because the body's very wise in that this bartholinitis occurs when there's something happening that's not quite right in the vagina. But it did happen after using these Kegel balls. Wow. So it was I probably left them in too long, maybe. So they shouldn't be inside too long, maybe, these Kegel balls. And I thought I was clever, like walking around going shopping and keeping them in for a long time and getting a strong pelvic floor. But but these days I'm doing different things, condom and different things, just to be safe, because at least I know it's a new surface area every time, so I have that peace of mind.
Yeah. And they sell these, like, saying, oh, you can go shopping while wearing Kegel balls. I mean, I've seen that marketed that way. You can vacuum, well, apparently you can't unless you have a condom.
Yeah. And also now I've done lots of research about Kegel balls and pelvic floor trainers. I don't even recommend them at all, because you're putting your muscles into a constant involuntary contraction when you should be contracting and relaxing. That's how you make a muscle stronger. So I actually recommend the ones that are app controlled, so that they're not weight based, so you can actually play video games with your vagina, so you're relaxing, contracting. There's some really fantastic things around now. So I mean, I'm not really into video games, but I mean, if I'm getting my pelvic floor stronger and I'm like killing birds, like going, it's so cool, because they do measure the contraction as well, because that's just as important. And that's another reason why I would not recommend yoni eggs, because that's another totally different sector. But I mean, that kind of sector is also coming into the sex toy world, the crystal ones and yoni eggs. And people are saying, oh yeah, keep it in your vagina all night long to do some healing. It's absolute rubbish. It's so dangerous. And those things could be painted glass from China. You don't really know if it's a real gem. And then there's also porosity, and there's maybe some stones are toxic. So it's just like it's very scary what people are doing, and there's just no control over it. And also the shame, and then people not reporting it. And who knows what that's going to do to you in the long run.
Yeah, I need to get that vagina. I am into video games, and I want to play that vagina video game. You have to tell me what.
Oh, it's called Perifit. It's amazing, and they've got about 5 different games. And one of them is like you're a big shark going through the under the water, and you have to like eat all these fish. And then because what it is that, for example, there are things that come to you, and you have to make sure you're relaxed at that point. So the relaxation is just as important as the squeezing. And that's why that's so important. If you speak to anyone who is a physiotherapist who's specialized in the pelvic floor, they will tell you the same thing, that it's just as important to relax, contract, not just like constant involuntary contraction. That's what it's like when you are using weighted balls or yoni eggs and things like that. So it's called Perifit, but I'll send it to you after. It's Perifit. It's absolutely amazing. It's just, and it's got 2 sensors, so you can kind of like it tells you which one is stronger, and so you got double the work there.
I'm gonna have the strongest vagina ever, because I'm so motivated by video games. Like I do video game exercise. So yes. Do they have one for your anus?
Today, what? Is there one for the anus?
Yeah.
I don't know. I think obviously, again, I think with the, if you make sure it's outside, then maybe you could do it that way. But in general, I don't think an anus needs that work, but it's still the vagina is kind of like where you would maybe benefit more, but it's all the same muscles, really. It's all a whole kind of like a hammock holding everything together. But it's really a lot of fun. And also what I love about it is you get biofeedback. So over time, you can see how you're getting stronger. You have to do it for about 3 months, 3 times a week. And then you can do different programs. For example, there's one for overactive bladder, which is my situation. And then other ones for like maybe postpartum after having a baby, and other ones for incontinence. So there's all different programs that focus on longer squeezes, short, faster squeezes. So it's really interesting. And if once you finish one program, then you can just do another one and just get super strong. And then you can start lifting. I saw this woman who was lifting cans of beans with her vagina because she had a few children, and she was having issues like sneezing and peeing, and then she decided to get really strong. That she was on the British TV. So you never know. And I think it's so important because also those muscles help with back pain, and it helps with lots of things, hip pain, and better orgasms, better grip.
I want to lift cans of beans with my vagina. That sounds like such a great like party trick.
Oh yeah, and there's a woman actually, I can't remember her name, but she lifts like surfboards. She's got a whole Instagram of her doing vaginal weightlifting. That's what it's called, vaginal weightlifting. It's interesting.
That's incredible. It should be in the Olympics.
Oh yeah. That might be the next book for you. So what about one of the things that surprised you in your research?
So a lot of stuff surprised me. I mean, first off, one of the things that surprised me was how, I mean, like we talked about before, how the feminist movement was like don't use dildos. Because of the patriarchal stuff, but also because they're not natural. So there'd be things like, oh, you can use a cucumber, which I would not recommend for people to masturbate with. Right. But it was this anti-technology ethos in the 60s and 70s. And it was this counterculture thing. And, dildos were made of plastic or PVC, whatever. Like, so there was this fight against that, in which, I mean, ties into what we're saying about poorly made toys, right? Because there were poorly made toys, but they were arguing that sex should be natural and you shouldn't use any devices. You should be able to just figure it out with your own body and, in your sexual relationships. And it took a really long time for people to accept. I mean, I would say third wave feminists accept sex toys. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, probably. But I wasn't into them until quite recently. I mean, after watching Sex and the City, The Rabbit, that was what got me into them.
That was your thing.
Yeah. And that was several years after it happened. But I mean, I think The Rabbit was the big thing. I'm not sure if it's still the world's biggest selling sex toy, but that was been a thing for so long. I mean, that's been around a long time before it got to be mainstream, to be honest. I think you said it was in the book that it was the 80s or something. Yeah.
So Vibratex, like The Rabbit, was such an interesting story because it's this second generation sex toy entrepreneur. So this woman's father actually had a series of sex toy shops in the 60s and 70s in the LA area. And his wife, so her mom, so this is like Shay, I believe Martin is her last name. Her mother was Japanese and her father was Jewish. I believe he was Jewish. I assume everyone's Jewish because I'm Jewish, but there were a lot of Jews in the sex toy industry. And they went to Japan one day in the 60s and to visit her family, and they saw all these amazing looking vibrators, where so much more interesting. Our vibrators were like flesh colored, which meant Caucasian flesh, hard plastic, C batteries, D batteries, crap stuff. I mean, it was okay, it worked, but it wasn't it was smooth, nothing exciting. Went there and saw all these vibrators that look like the rabbit, the iconic rabbit everyone knows, but also like the beaver. And there would be like a bird, and there would be, I think they had like a bear. They had all these different animals. It was like woodland creatures. And instead of just having a straight vibrator, which is what basically everything in the US was, that you would supposed to insert in your vagina, which isn't going to give you the kind of orgasm if it's just clitoral. They all had like a little clitoral vibrator coming out, like the rabbit. So it could give you vaginal and clitoral stimulation. And he decided to import them to the US in the 60s and 70s. And in Japan at the time, it was illegal to sell sex toys or make them. So they put little faces on them and called them dolls. And so a lot of these sex toys, even to this day, I sold sex toys in 2005 that had the faces on them. They still imported, you still get these sex toys with dolls that look like dolls or have the faces. And then Shay went into the industry herself, and she continued to import these. And one of the ones she imported was a vibrator. Was the rabbit vibrator.
That's fantastic. So it's been around for a long time then.
Yeah, it has.
So after your book ends, I guess if you did a second edition, then you'd have to include all the sucking toys, the womanizer, the satisfier, and all that. So have you thought about how you would add on to this? Have you thought about how you could? It would be like 10 years, I guess. How long is it since you finished writing this book?
It was 4 years ago.
Okay.
But things have changed in 4 years. So yeah, it would be a lot of womanizer stuff, and the suction dildos, vibrators, which are innovative, in and of itself, this innovative technology. But the other thing would be VR porn, that's sex toy enabled, which I'm actually thinking of writing an article about, soon, or actually I'm going to, but it's like those videos where it shows, for the women, it would show like a man going down on her, and then the toy would be moving in tune to the tongue. But usually we think of them as like a blowjob device, a fleshlight, and woman giving a blowjob or fucking through VR. But that's what I would be talking about. I'm actually talking to a VR porn director today, because they are doing female point of view VR porn. Because this is my pet peeve with porn, is they always say POV porn, and it's always a man's perspective. It's like, I'm like, oh, POV, oh, look, I see a dick. And yes, I want a dick. It would be fun once in a while, but like, I'd also like to see it from a woman's point of view. So I think that we're seeing some shifts in porn. And I think this integration between porn and sex toys for women as well is an interesting thing I would write, or am going to write about it.
And also the integration of apps. I'm reviewing a lot of app toys now, and it makes my work a lot longer. I've got to try things manually and with the app, and then with distance. There's just so many things now. And the amount of patterns you can do with 2 motors, it's just infinite. And you can connect with different people, have video chat, and it's just like incredible, all the things that are possible these days. And also what you're saying about POV just then, it was interesting about the women's perspective, because I remember I'm not really into porn at all. Makes me quite uncomfortable. However, a few years ago, when the first phone cameras came out, I had a boyfriend, and we started just recording ourselves. It was like a whole new, I think a lot of people did when they could find it was easy to record, naughty things. And when he was recording having sex and just all what he was seeing, I kind of understood porn a bit more, because I thought he, even in Missionary, he can see the kind of in, out motion, shake it all about. Whereas the woman, you're just seeing a guy kind of on top. Or if you're doing doggy style, that's a great visual thing for a guy, but we just see the wall, so I can kind of understand why men are more visual.
Yeah, that's interesting. I need to do that experiment. That is fascinating. Yeah, well, what's interesting about the men being more visual, and I'm going to write this as well, is actually research shows that women are more turned on by visual stimulation than men. And so this is like one of my arguments, because I'm writing my next book on gigolos, like men who have sex with women for money, but is that like our culture doesn't allow for the female gaze. So a lot of women have sort of repressed that visual stimulation, that because our culture doesn't think it's important, and it caters to men in a patriarchal culture. So I'm hoping I can get that idea out there soon.
That's cool. So what do you think about the future of sex toys? Have you got any idea of where things might be going? You've mentioned VR.
Yeah, I mean, so VR is a thing. VR has always been like the new thing. I actually have a VR video game thing that I play. And so this is what one guy I talked to claimed, who was in the VR space, which was that we're going to be able to, it'll be like Facebook for porn, or so Facebook for fucking, and we'll all be able to go in these VR spaces with our app-enabled sex toys and have sex with each other. Now, is that what we're going to do on a regular basis? Probably not. But it's
like Second Life, but with VR.
Yeah,
Second Life.
What?
Do you remember a thing called Second Life?
Yes. Yes.
I mean, so it'd be like that, but with VR. That could be.
Yeah. I mean, that would be crazy. I mean, could be interesting. But I think in the more day-to-day, I mean, you mentioned the app-enabled sex toys, and I mean, those get hacked into, the things that are connected to the internet. There was a story about a butt plug that expands, and someone hacked into it and it expanded and they couldn't get it out of their asshole. Like John Oliver, who's a comedian in the US, said this whole thing about that. So there's the security issues as well with app-enabled sex toys, which are a little scary. I'm hoping, but I mean, in reality, look, we're always finding new ways to get off. New technology, we're always like hyping up the next big thing, but at the end of the day, I mean, what do I use? I use a Hitachi magic wand that's like 50, the design is 50 years old. That's not exactly true. It's been tweaked a bit. But what do we need? 1,000 patterns? Do we need to have something made of like the newest material? Not necessarily. We need, the womanizer is a great innovation, so hopefully we'll have more like that. I do think that in the industry, there's not a ton of innovation as far as stimulation, like the womanizer, those kind of things are big innovations, but there isn't enough. I don't know. It seems like everyone just thinks they need to connect their butt plug to the internet and boom, call it a day, as opposed to maybe making a new design.
What I think is interesting that's happened maybe since the pandemic is the popularity of panty vibes, wearables. Because also, we know when you're obviously using a Hitachi or a wand massage, or I think most of women do want to have a continuous strong vibration. So you might have 10 patterns, but you're only using 1 or 2, really. You just want the strongest continuous. However, when you're using it as a tease and someone else is controlling it, you don't want continuous. You want to have like different types of patterns. It's not about orgasm at all. So I think it's really interesting how the pandemic has changed how we use sex toys, and it's not just about the orgasm, but that tease and keeping someone on edge, and that delicious torture of being in public and someone's controlling you. I think that's quite interesting. And also a few years ago, I actually I took part in a BBC documentary about sex dolls and sex robots. This is an industry that's very catered to the male gaze and the male consumer. So they wanted a female who was in it, who's not a doll, just to kind of get some balance. So they brought me this male doll called Stephen. It's obviously made for a guy because it had like the blowjob mouth, and it was very heavy. And so I had to kind of try it for this documentary. And I just thought, there's no way. I mean, imagine like this really heavy doll. You have to do all the work yourself, whereas women can kind of have the luxury of just lying back and doing nothing oftentimes. And I just thought, there's no way that it's going to be as popular as the rabbit. But I just do wonder if one day there will be more women, because you can actually hug them as well. And It's hard work.
That's a really good point though, because I have looked into male sex dolls for women, and I talked to some manufacturers who said they're too heavy. Like people aren't thinking about like women. I mean, even a lot of men can't lift. Like how much did Steven weigh?
Oh, I don't know. It was quite heavy. And then I lived in a 6th floor without a lift at the time. And it was so hard for me to get someone to take it out, like DHL, because they only send one person up. So it was like in this box in the middle of the lounge, like a coffin. It was so creepy. I had to step over it all the time. And this poor guy came to pick it up, and he's like, "What's inside?" And I said, "Exercise equipment," because the company had briefed me to say that's what they say, you know. You don't say a mannequin, you know.
Exercise equipment. That is hilarious. Yeah, that is crazy. I know they're too heavy. And the design, like, I mean, what woman is gonna want to like have sex with something with a blowjob mouth? Like, that's not attractive. I think you could design a sex doll with cunnilingus mouth or something.
Oh yeah, like, that'd be nice.
That would be really nice. And that has, you know, like if I were designing a sex doll for women, I don't know if Steven, did he have a clitoral stimulator?
Well, he had a removable dildo, so I just put my own dildo on it. It's like a hole, because I didn't know, because I do lend these things out for trials. Who knows who had tested it before me and what they did with it. So I just made sure it was my own dildo, and it was a lot smaller than the one that was provided. So that was interesting. But what was interesting now, and also it's new technology, is the thrusters, you know, those toys that thrust.
Yeah.
I mean, that's an interesting thing you could have. But that's the interesting thing about dot dolls. You can actually just remove and make them have a clitoral stimulator. There's lots of different things. And also with a guy using a doll, I think if you're doing missionary, that the weight is not such a big deal, you know, because they're just lying down. But with a woman, I think, you know, I think most women just are not always active during the act of penetration.
Yeah, and I wouldn't want to have this guy, you know, an 80-pound doll that's not moving with your body, like, and then you'd have to be on top during it. Yeah, you're right. They need to figure out, like, you'd have to suspend Steven from your ceiling or something. I don't know. I do think that there's something there for women, like with sex dolls, because I'm in some Facebook group for sex toy people. And this one woman who owns a store in Florida said an elderly woman during the pandemic bought a male sex doll for sex and companionship because she was like living alone. And I think that's pretty cool. Like, I know elderly people buy those things that look like seals that they can pet. Have you heard about it?
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think companion sex dolls for elderly people, because they're still horny. We have this idea that older people don't want to have sex. And maybe they can talk to, and, you know, so yeah, there's a bunch of different places. I would love to see that industry, like brothel for women with sex dolls and humans, like that would be nice.
There was a brothel for dolls in Barcelona, actually, a few years ago. I think it's closed down now, but they had to pay a deposit just in case, you know, before they used the doll. They were cleaned obviously between sessions. There's a very kind of I thought it was quite a frivolous topic when I agreed to do this into this documentary, but then there's also a dark side to it, like if people are kind of normalizing abuse or rape like putting it, or, you know, this, you just don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing. But going back to the female sexual consumer, so now you're working with on a book about gigolos, is that correct?
Yes, it sure is.
So tell me about that. What inspired you to research this topic?
Well, what inspired me was I was living in Berlin, like actually finishing up this book in 2017, and sex work is legal there. And I was like, oh, great. Like, what is there for women? Because there was like a brothel down the street, and there were strip clubs everywhere, and you could just hire anybody. And there was so little like sex, like men to hire for women. Very, very little. And there were things like rub and tugs for women, like, which is, you know, rub and tugs?
No.
It's like a massage where they give you a hand job.
Okay, they have a tantric massage. They have that in Barcelona, but they're usually women giving the massages, actually.
Yeah,
There are some men as well, but it's usually like a woman like fulfilling a bisexual fantasy kind of thing.
exactly. And that's the same in most places, but they had men for women. So I actually hired a man. I did a tantra massage and I really enjoyed it. And that was part of what spurred the book, which was like, okay, like I paid for sex, I paid for a hand job. It was great. This stranger gave me an orgasm. Wow, like my clitoris, my whole system down there, it's very hard to figure out. You have to be like a 33-degree angle and do this. You know, I'm like, how did he figure it all out? That's incredible. This should be available for all women. And what's the history of this? And so that's what kind of spurred me. Oh my God, the history is crazy. And there's gigolos were huge in the early 1910s, people who paid men that women paid to dance with them. And then dancing the tango sometimes led to sex. And these were an accepted thing. And I'm like, well, why aren't there gigolos today? I mean, there are a few, but there was supposed to be a brothel in Nevada started by Heidi Fleiss in 2005, the Stud Farm. And that never took off. We've had very few legal male escorts in the US. I can count 3. We have one now in Nevada. He's a trans guy. But yeah, I think that gigolos can be a feminist thing for women. And I'm really hoping, yeah. So anyway, this is what spurred my book.
Oh, it's interesting topic. What else am I going to ask you? So a couple of quick questions. What's the book that changed your life?
What's of the book that changed my life? Oh my God, so many books did. I would have to say, I don't want to be pretentious, and I'm actually looking at a book that was one of the most important books in my life, which was like Swan's Way by Proust.
What's it called? Sorry.
Swan's Way by Marcel Proust.
Okay.
And that changed my life in part because I realized a fiction book could not really have a strong plot and could be just about a person's inner life, and that inner life could drive a narrative. And that was a really big deal to me. But another thing that changed my life was, and this isn't a book, it's really a poet, Gregory Corso, who's a beat poet, and Jim Carroll, and they wrote poems about genitals and about sex, and they were considered part of the literary canon. And that made me realize, oh, I can write about sex and be taken seriously. And so those are the kind of things that changed my life.
Fantastic. Do you have a quote or affirmation that you live by, or a life philosophy?
Well, I do have a life philosophy, and this is, I don't have a quote, but so my best friend died of cancer at age 36 last month.
Wow.
Allison Murray. And she had stage 4 cancer for 3 years. And seeing her deal with that and be so brave and keeping positive, that changed my life. And so that made me realize so my philosophy now is live every day like you have stage 4 cancer.
Wow.
You know, don't take a minute, like do everything you want to do. Don't take a minute for granted if you're healthy. And it doesn't really, nothing matters about like what what other people think of you, or what you should, what society thinks of you, like, because we all could like get cancer and die. I know that's like really dark, but so we have to just take joy in whatever and live our lives, because life is so unexpected. So she really taught me that, and that's been my life philosophy. And I wish I do not want to learn this way. I want Allison to still be here, and she's not, and life sucks because of that. But that's been my philosophy.
That's interesting. It's definitely something I definitely agree with. And it sounds like a cliche, but you have to live like that, definitely. I saw something recently on Instagram called the 4K Weeks. Have you heard of it? It's basically a poster And when you buy it, you put your date of birth, so it tells you how many weeks you've been alive. They're literally crossed off, and it looks like a tally chart. It's very scary. It can be quite morbid, or it can just be a wake-up call, depending on how you look at it. But it's really kind of like, look how much time you've got left, and trying to help you kind of like really think how you want to spend your time and energy. It's really interesting. Yeah.
That is so interesting. Yeah, because we rarely think, like I've learned through Allison having cancer, like death is as scary to talk about as sex for a lot of people. And so I'm trying to talk more openly about that as well.
And speaking of what other people think, there's a part of your book that kind of made me cry when I read it. I'm going to have to read it out. You say, finally, thanks to everybody in the sex toy industry who was willing to withstand personal criticism in order to follow their dreams of making the world a better place. That's something I can really resonate with, because some people think that sex toys are frivolous or scandalous or both. Whereas there is a massive cause behind it. You know, it's about female pleasure and orgasmic independence, which for me anyway, influenced my emotional life. It meant I wasn't reliant on toxic sex with great sex with toxic men, which is kind of like why I bought my first vibrator. But it's a really great thing to read, because I think have you encountered some judgment around being in this industry?
Yeah, and I mean that. Thank you for saying that. I'm glad that touched you. Like, I actually was like crying a little bit when I wrote that. It was like emotional for me, because I had a lot of pushback, like from my thesis advisor at university. Well, no, actually, he was nice, but he initially said, like, don't do this. Like, wait until you get tenure. And because it's controversial, don't write about the history of sex toys. And I was like, well, I probably will never get tenure because of the way academia is. And Chili's Bar and Grill said they would always hire me back, which was a restaurant I was waiting tables at. And so I'm like, look, that's my backup plan, and I'm gonna write about this, and who gives a shit? Like, and because like he was very laid back, and he's like, okay, like he was fine. I mean, but a lot of people won't push back against that, right? Like they, an older white man tells them don't do this, and they listen. I mean, I luckily had a dad who I could push around, who, if he told me not to do something, I'd be like, no, Dad, you're stupid. So like I had a very laid back dad who was a model for that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, there was a pushback. Another person on my dissertation committee, and this is for, my dissertation that became Buzz, he said, he's like, I want to speak to you after my dissertation defense. And I thought he was going to say good things, because I thought it went well. And I came to his office, and he said, well, Hallie, you said that sex toys are for liberated women. Well, none of my girlfriends ever use sex toys, so that can't be true. And that was it. That was his comment on all my research and my years of research and all this. And I came home from hearing that, and I cried. And I remember telling Allison, actually, who just died, I said, I'm crying. He said these things to me. She's like, let's unpack this. He didn't mention anything about your research. He just said, he mentioned his own girlfriends. A, he's an egotist. And B, he is not critiquing you. It's just about his personal experience, his insecurities. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff, which was disturbing, like from men. There were also a second wave feminist woman on my during my defense who said, well, is it even worth studying sex toys? Are they a worthy subject of study? And I pushed back against, I said, well, people write whole academic books on the pencil, and no one's complaining about them. And then she shut up. So there is this kind of sense of having to be, you don't have to be aggressive, but it helps. Because there is pushback. Women's sexuality is always viewed as frivolous, or has been, and men's sexuality is necessary for the continuance of the species. So that's why Viagra is marketed everywhere. And the minute like we have a vibrator advertisement somewhere, people freak out and say, oh my God, it's salacious. So this kind of double standard still exists, and we still need to fight against it.
Definitely. Fantastic. So where can people find you?
On Twitter, Hallie Lieberman is my Twitter handle. It's my Instagram handle. I have a website. but yeah, and I write articles for a lot of different publications. So I'm always writing. I write a lot for BuzzFeed News, but I've written for New York Times, Washington Post, lots of places.
Fantastic. Well, Hallie Lieberman, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been really interesting. Talking about sex toys, my favorite subject.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It was fascinating.